Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Jason Freeman, the Author Events Office's very own precision engineer, and I'm excited to be here tonight to introduce Simon Winchester. In searching for an appropriate quote about engineers and engineerings for tonight's introduction, I was struck by how many relevant ones seem to come from 20th century science fiction writers. Kurt Vonnegut, William Gibson, he's still alive, Arthur C. Clarke. I don't think this is a coincidence. Robert Heinlein said, "One man's magic is another man's engineering." And I think that's just it, that engineering has given birth to the miracles, to the magic of our time. And sadly, I think it's sometimes in our nature to ignore the miraculous that's all around us. If only there were an erudite, entertaining, expert writer to show us how all this came to be. I think tonight's guest is surely the man for the job. Celebrated by the New York Times Book Review for interweaving history, fascinating trivia, and acute observation, and by the Wall Street Journal as an engaging raconteur with an enviable, capacious vocabulary. Simon Winchester is the best-selling author of nearly 30 books, including The Professor and the Madman, The Men Who United the States, Atlantic, Pacific, and a personal favorite, Krakatoa. Formerly an Oxford-trained field geologist in Uganda and a war correspondent for The Guardian and The Sunday Times, he was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2006. Tonight, Mr. Winchester joins us with The Perfectionists, How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World. Spanning a rollicking 200-year period in the quest for ever more precise calibration and construction, it tells the story of how engineers and instruments gave birth to the modern world. Reassesses the contributions of forgotten engineers such as Joseph Bramah, while undeifying supposedly sacrosanct inventors such as Eli Whitney. And also offers anecdotal tales of both the author's own career as an engineer as well as that of his father, who he honors on the book's dedication page as a, quote, most meticulous man. Here to tell us more, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Simon Winchester back to the Free Library.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be back here. This book was going to be called Exactly, and indeed the English edition, which comes out in about 3 weeks, is to be called Exactly. But the marketing people at HarperCollins in New York said, no, it's difficult in America to sell a book that is based on a concept, so can we get people in there somehow into the title? And so I came up eventually with the Perfectionists, seeing to be people. We talked about exactitude, we talked about impeccable. There are a lot of words, including meticulous, related to my father. So it seems that precision has a large vocabulary, and it's a somewhat confusing one. So I'm going to start this evening's talk by giving you simply a definition, getting the boring stuff out of the way immediately. What is the difference between precision and accuracy? And it's a significant and important difference. Accuracy is how close something is to your intention. And the way of illustrating that is to think of, if I was in England, I'd say a dartboard, but as I'm in America, I'll say a target for pistol shooting. So your intention is clearly to hit the center of the target. And if you do that, you have achieved great accuracy. If you fire at the target, and time after time after time, your bullets, or indeed your arrows or your darts, hit another part of the target, not necessarily in the center, but every time you do it, you achieve the same result, then that is great precision. Precision is doing something and doing it again and again and again to exactly the same standard, in exactly the same direction, with exactly the same result. Not necessarily what you wanted, but it's repeated every time. Obviously, to achieve great precision and great accuracy by getting everything time after time in the center is what you really want. But in engineering, this becomes incorporated in the whole world of interchangeable parts that are identical time after time after time, and make the making of things consequently a great deal easier. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But the distinction, and I'm pretty lazy in this book, I tend to use the terms more or less interchangeably, but precision and accuracy to an engineer are very different things. So how did all this come about? It's sort of a strange story. First of all, I used to be a journalist and still do a bit of it. And in 1984 or 5, I think it was 4, I was given what must have been the dreamiest of dream assignments by the Sunday Times in London, who I was working for. They said, I think England was either flirting with or had just joined the European Union. And anyway, the English, being the English, know little about the continent and want to know even less. But nonetheless, the Sunday Times magazine, which seemed to have a lot of money to spend in those days, said, Winchester, try and explain these foreigners, these Europeans, by way of by making 6 journeys with a photographer around Europe. Choose any conveyance you want. And so I had a photographer on the paper called Patrick Ward, and we decided to do the following. We, first of all, got a yacht and sailed it from Stockholm to Helsinki across the Baltic. And then I rode a horse through the Black Forest of Germany. I drove a motorbike from Munich to Turin. I walked from Cadiz to Gibraltar. I took a train from Victoria Station in London to the Hotel Victoria in Brieg in Switzerland. And then, so that was 5 knocked off. And then the one which we thought would sort of be the culminating journey was to take a car from the westernmost point of Europe to the easternmost. And the westernmost point of Europe, as I'm sure you realize, is in northern Spain. But we slightly cheated, and we had the peninsula, the Pointe de Corsen, which is at the western end of Finisterre. And the eastern end we chose was the city of Astrakhan, where the Volga goes into the Caspian Sea, deep in those days in the Soviet Union. So Patrick and I were having done the other journeys, were sitting in the Travellers Club, a club I belonged to in London, and obviously having a rather boozy lunch, because the thought was that we'd set off in my rather broken down old Volvo, which is the car I was driving in London at the time. But then I had the bright idea, wouldn't it be nice to take a Rolls-Royce? So I thought, Patrick said, oh, call the Rolls-Royce the factory. I'm sure they'll... Well, I rang them up and I said, Simon Winchester, we're doing this article. And instead of falling off his chair with derisive laughter, the man said, I'll call you back in half an hour. So Patrick and I had another drink, and then he called back and said, well, you're in luck, because we have a brand new silver Spirit in ocean blue, which comes off the production line tomorrow in Crewe, and it's a cancelled order, and you can have it for 3 months. Go wherever you like. So I went up to the factory and was shown around, I mean, the magnificent production line, as it were, of Rolls-Royce motors, and was given this magnificent machine. I'd never driven a Rolls-Royce in my life before. Don't think I'd ever been in one either. And the only slightly embarrassing thing is that it had a number plate, which was RRM1, for Rolls-Royce Motors 1. But that was actually quite convenient, because when I parked it outside the offices of the Sunday Times, the parking wardens thought it was Rupert Murdoch. When I took it home to the village in Oxfordshire where I lived, all the locals thought it was Roger Moore. So one way or another, it was an amazing tool. So we drove off, and it was a long and complicated journey. I won't bore you with the details. But the photograph that they used to inaugurate the series of these 6 articles was the one that Patrick took of me and the car outside the Great Gate of Kiev in the Ukraine, then, of course, Soviet Union again. And there was just an agitprop picture of Lenin standing astride something or other and pointing into the middle distance to the joys of socialist utopia or some such nonsense. And I was echoing what he was doing in the background by sitting on the hood or the bonnet of this great motor car, pointing into the joys of a capitalist future. And they ran this, I'm sure it never sold a lick in Kiev, but anyway, this attracted the attention of the Rolls-Royce marketing people, and the result of this was that I was given Rolls-Royces for years following. I mean, not given as in given, but loaned Rolls-Royces. And in fact, the very next story I did, also for the Colour magazine with another photographer called Don McCullin, was in Los Angeles, covering the gangs of East Los Angeles who had threatened to disrupt the Olympic Games of '84. So we flew to LA and I think we checked into the Ambassador Hotel, the one where Bobby Kennedy was killed. And at the check-in desk, the man said, oh, Mr. Winchester, there's an envelope for me. And there was a little brown envelope, the keys to, yes, another Rolls-Royce. And it was Rolls-Royce of Beverly Hills, and they said, we're very pleased you're being a sort of ambassador for this motor car. And I hope I'm not being unduly vulgar in what I say here, but we drove this car. It was so ugly, this car. It was, I don't know, Ruritanian ambassadors might have driven it. It was enormous. It was white with a sort of black tonneau cover, and it was huge. It weighed about 4 tons. And it was slow, and it did about 5 miles to the gallon or something. But I remember vividly driving it. It became a very useful journalistic tool because the gang members that we went to see, I promise you I am going to get to precision in a minute, said we don't want to be photographed, but on the other hand, if we can be photographed driving this car, then, and so I think the picture that we used was of the head of a gang called the White Fences with a big cigar and a machine gun at the wheel of this magnificent car. So it was a very useful tool. But I do remember in the sort of design business that I was parked at a red light and a convertible swept up alongside me, and there were 2 young women in this convertible, and one of them said, "Hey, is that a Rolls-Royce?" And I said, "Yes, it is, actually," in a sort of superior manner. And she said, "It's the ugliest fucking car I've ever seen in my life," and sped off into the distance. But anyway, the result of all this is that I went many times to the factory and came to know Rolls-Royces pretty well and their history. And I do remember vividly being shown a crankshaft, a beautifully machined thing about that long and weighing many hundreds of pounds, which had been made by hand. And the engineer who made it was showing me that if you spun it between two bearings, it wouldn't stop, because no part of it was any heavier than other. It was so perfectly balanced. The only thing that would eventually stop it was friction. And I marveled at the precision of the way these cars were made. And I should say, parenthetically, that my father, to whom I've dedicated the book, was a precision engineer. He made small electric motors for the guidance systems of torpedoes. And I actually recount this at the beginning of the story, one evening when I was about 8, I think, he brought home this beautiful wooden oak box with his name on a brass plaque on the front. He wanted to show it to me. And he opened it up, put it on the dining room table, and in it was about 110, I think it's actually 103, small, beautifully machined steel cubes of ever-decreasing size. And they're what are known as gauge blocks or Joe blocks. And I'd never seen these things before, but they looked absolutely wonderful. They all had numbers on them to 3 decimal places. And he took them out and it was about to put them on the tablecloth. My mother, they were just about to serve dinner. My mother comes from Belgium and she was from Ghent, where they make lace, and this was a lace tablecloth. And she hated my father bringing stuff back from the factory because it was always covered with a thin layer of machine oil. So as he put these 2 blocks down on the tablecloth, she gave a little cry and ran off into the kitchen, I think visibly distressed. But he showed me these blocks and then said you put one on top of the other. If you can imagine steel cubes about an inch by an inch, and put one on top of the other, and he said, now pick up the top one. And I picked it up, and the bottom one came with it. And he said, no, pull them, we only want the top one. So I tried very hard to pull it, and it wouldn't budge. Now, these were made of stainless steel, so they were not magnetic, and he demonstrated that they were not magnetic. But some force was binding these 2 things together. And he took them from me after I'd struggled really hard to try and pull them apart. And he slid them apart. You slide the top one off the bottom, and it's a process called ringing, W-R-I-N-G-I-N-G. But he said the interesting thing about why these 2 blocks seem to be welded together is that they are so perfectly, so impeccably flat. There are no asperities that allow air or something in, and the molecules briefly, temporarily bond with one another, and the 2 pieces become essentially one. And he said that is one of the bases of precision engineering, the knowledge of how you make something perfectly flat, and that was achieved by a person I'll talk about in a few moments. So with my love for Rolls-Royces, and the unaffordability of Rolls-Royces, of course, and with my father having sort of told me about this by little episodes like this, I was very fertile ground when about 6 years ago, a chap wrote to me, a stranger, someone I'd never heard of before, from Florida. He was called Colin Povey, P-O-V-E-Y, And he introduced himself. He just wrote 3 paragraphs, and he said, "Dear Mr. Winchester, forgive me intruding on your time, but I've read all your books, and I like them," which is jolly nice to hear. "And I've wondered whether you might care to write a book about the history of precision. And precision is everywhere. It's invisible. It's absolutely essential to our lives. And I think you could, become interested in this." So I rang him up, and I thought we had a long conversation, and he told me he was a scientific glassblower. He blew very intricate pieces of glass for laboratories. And I put the idea, I had another book or 2 to write still, but we kept in correspondence over the years, and gradually it seemed that this not only was fascinating, but the worry we had at the publishing house was, did it have a sort of narrative thread to it? He knew, I knew, when I did the research, that precision has a starting point. It may also, as I think we'll discuss in a few moments, have a potential end point. But how do you keep a narrative flow? And I'll try and explain how that was, and it's all to do with tolerances. The first true precision thing ever made, and in the book I do talk about John Harrison's clocks, and I talk about an extraordinary piece of clockwork, as it were, that was made and found by a sponge diver in 1906 that had been made by the Greeks 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. It's a thing called the Antikythera mechanism. And these things, John Harrison's clocks particularly, look as if they're precise, but they're not really, because they only made one of each. And to make something precise, as I explained, you've got to make it again and again and again. And the first thing that truly was precise, and there were 500 of them made, was made by a man called John Wilkinson. And John Wilkinson is known to this day as Iron Mad Wilkinson. He lived in the latter part of the 18th century, and he was obsessed with iron. They had iron ore on his family estate in, I think it was Cumberland in northwest England, and he built himself an iron pulpit like this. He had an iron desk, an iron table, iron chairs. He had an iron boat. It's not, I suppose, a very revolutionary thing. Most boats are made of iron, but in those days it was. He had an iron coffin, which he kept in his workshop, and apparently he used to play tricks on particularly comely young women who used to come to his occasionally, not quite sure why, to his workshop, but he would lie in the coffin and then pop out and startle them. And he is indeed buried in this coffin under an iron obelisk near Liverpool. And his business was making cannons for the Royal Navy. Now, cannons used to be made by casting iron in a mould, and the central hole through which the bullet, as it were, comes, the cannonball comes, was made in the mould. In other words, there was a central bit that left a hole when the iron cooled. But these cast iron cannons were very fragile things. They had a tendency to explode. There were all sorts of imperfections in them. And Wilkinson perfected a method, which sounds to us incredibly simple, of drilling a hole into a block of solid iron and making the hole for the barrel of the cannon that way. You take your great block of iron, you may have a drill which you mount on a sort of railway leading towards the face of the iron, and then push it very hard, but in a straight line. That's the important thing, on a flat surface. That's very important, into the iron. And if, with luck and good judgment and a fair wind, you'll develop a hole which is straight and true and the same diameter from one end to the other. And the Royal Navy loved this, and they lapped it up, and he became the principal cannon maker to the Royal Navy. Well, at about this time, James Watt was making proper steam engines. I'm sure you'll know the original steam engines were single-cylinder things made essentially to pump the water out of tin mines in Cornwall by a man called Newcomen. But Watt realized in this epiphany while walking across a park in Glasgow one day that the inefficiency of a steam engine came from the fact that the same cylinder that worked the piston was used both to cool and to heat the water, and that was no good. Everything had to be done in a secondary cylinder. So he came up with a true working, relatively efficient steam engine, except the cylinders were made by taking a sheet of iron and hammering it until it formed a circle, and then welding the circle together, turning the whole thing vertically, putting the piston into it. And of course the piston was, the cylinder rather, was totally imperfect. It didn't form a circle. There were dings and bends and bumps, and so steam went all over the place. And the steam engine was in its early days was a pretty lamentable affair. But nonetheless, 70 miles away from James Watt's factory was Wilkinson, keen to have a steam engine to drive the drill to make the cannons. And so Watt brought over an engine, and Wilkinson said, "This is pathetic. I mean, it just simply doesn't work." And I can see what the problem is. You don't know how to make a cylinder. I'll make a cylinder for you. How big is your piston? And Watt came up with a number, let's say 36 inches. So he said, "I will drill a hole in a solid piece of iron, which is 36 inches and a little bit more, and we'll see if that works as a cylinder." And it did. And you turn this thing up vertically. It looks effectively like a vertical cannon. Put the piston in it, and the tolerance, the piston from the outer edge of the piston to the inner edge of the cylinder was the thickness of an English shilling. It was 1/10 of an inch, 0.1 of an inch. And lo and behold, there was no leakage of steam. The thing worked like a charm. It developed great power. And effectively, the Industrial Revolution was born by this combination of John Wilkinson and James Watt. And Wilkinson then went on to build 500 more of these cylinders, varying dimensions for Watt, and the factory, Bolton and Watt it was called, prospered, and the Industrial Revolution was truly off to the races. So that was the first, and it was that number, 0.1, which made me think this is the way I can get a narrative thrust to this book. Because if I deal with the first chapter as being things that were made to a tolerance of 0.1, then the next chapter can be things that are made to a tolerance of let's say 0.0001, and then later on 0.0001. And going fast forward, I don't want to sort of get away with myself too much, but the most precise thing in the world today made by human agency happens also to be a cylinder, and oddly enough, about the same size as the cylinder of the early Watt steam engines. But it's not a piece of iron, it's a piece of fused silica, and it is a reflector employed in this device. I'm sure most of you will have heard of it. It has the acronym LIGO. LIGO means the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, and there are two of them, one in Washington State and one in Louisiana. And the mirrors, these fused silica mirrors, have a precision about them, a flatness about them, a reflectability about them. It's no longer 0.1 or 0.01 or 0.001, but 0.00 and 38 zeros until you get 1. They're incredibly, incredibly precise. And so the book essentially looks at things from 0.1 to 38 zeros, 0.1. And the way stations on the way, I mean, I could go on all night about them because there are many that are quite interesting, and I'll just pick out a couple which I think are fascinating. In the early days, once the Industrial Revolution had got underway, this had an interesting social effect, and the social effects of precision are very interesting, I find, in this book. And there's a sort of dark side to it, a sort of yin and yang, if you like. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the rich in Britain lived largely on landed estates. They had, big country houses, and it's just like Pride and Prejudice. And they had servants, and they had hedges, and they had ditches and walls and things. And the ruffians, if I can put it that way, non-judgmentally, were kept away. And the aristocracy felt largely safe. But 18th century, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, the rich were now people who had made their money as a virtue, as a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, and were living not in the countryside, but were living in cities, cheek by jowl with people who had a great deal of less money. And the impoverished were living in London, and the rich were living in London. And proximity leads to envy, leads to crime. And so one of the things that it was pretty swiftly recognized to keep burglaries at bay, as it were, burglars at bay, you build houses in London with stout front doors and good locks. And a man called Joseph Bramah, a very interesting man in and of himself, he invented one of the first flush lavatories. He invented the fountain pen, but also covered all bases by making a machine which could make quills in large numbers, just in case the fountain pen didn't catch on. He made a machine for numbering banknotes. So when you go to the bank and you see one of those things that's counting notes, Joseph Bramah, was the inventor. He invented the beer engine. Prior to his doing this, the beer had to be lugged up from the cellars by a drayman to the bar, but now you had an engine in the bottom and you just had a lever and you pour the beer. So when you have a drink, remember Joseph Bramah. There's one pub, only one, that's called Bramah's Arms, I think. But what he was fascinated by was making locks, and unpickable locks of great exactitude within. And he made one, and he was so proud of it in 1790, I think it was, that he had a workshop at 124 Piccadilly on the western end when you're getting towards rural western London. And in the bow window of this workshop, he put a lock, and it was called a challenge lock. Anyone that can pick this lock, I'll award 200 guineas to. And people came and tried, obviously without destroying it. And people came and tried but gave up. Nobody could pick it. And it was eventually 1851, in the Great Exhibition, when the lock was still unpicked. Joseph Bramah had died. His son, also by now an old man, was presiding over the company, which had prospered because everyone wanted to buy this lock that no one could pick. And an American from Boston called Charles Hall, who ran a lock company called Day and Newell, I think it was, in New York, said, I can pick it. And so the challenge was accepted, and it took him 51 hours, but he did manage to pick it in the end. And they paid him the 200 guineas, and not reluctantly, because if they could say, quite honestly, okay, this thing, yes, it will take a burglar 51 hours to pick it. So really, but the interesting thing is that the lock that Charles Hall had invented, called the para-utoptic lock, he said was absolutely unpickable. That yours was clearly pickable, even though it took 51 hours. But this one was not pickable. Well, it turned out that it was picked by someone who saw it and picked it in 15 minutes with the use of a simple piece of wood. And the name of the person that picked it was Linus Yale, of the Yale locks. So there was a sort of a poetry to all of that. Anyway, so locks were an early precise thing, as were two other things. And the story briefly then switches to France and ultimately to America, because a man called Honoré Blanc was an engineer who picked up the idea that you make the same thing over and over again. And what he was interested in was flintlock guns. The flintlock part of a gun has about 10 parts, all metal. There's a spring, there's something called a frizzle plate. There's the trigger, of course. There's the actual striking mechanism that hits the flint and causes the spark that ignites the powder that sends the projectile off. And if in battle, if in battle the trigger breaks, because each piece was made by hand, you had to go back to the gunsmith if you're a soldier and get him to make another gun from scratch, or at least certainly another flintlock part of it. But Blanc decided that what he would do, he would make every component, design machines to make the component, set the machines to certain specifications and tolerances, such that every part was exactly the same. They were all interchangeable, so that if you broke a trigger, you'd simply reach into a box called triggers, pull one out, put it in, and because it was interchangeable, the gun would work again in a couple of minutes. So he invited a demonstration of dignitaries to come over to look in his warehouse, his foundry in Paris. And one of the people that came to look was Thomas Jefferson. Because Jefferson was the American minister to Paris at the time, and he saw this and he was astounded. And he wrote a letter with, he was clearly astounded from the tone of the letter, to the Secretary of War back in Washington and said, this Frenchman has come up with a scheme for making guns, lots of them and perfectly, and I think we should adopt this practice over in this new formed country, America. Incidentally, I should say forgetting I was talking to an American audience, even though I'm now an American myself. Wilkinson's invention was first, he did the first drilling on the 4th of May, 1776. So it's an important, 1776 is important for many reasons, but the birth of precision is one of them. Anyway, back to Jefferson. He said we should have some engineer do this in America, and so who's interested? And Eli Whitney said, I'm interested and I can do it for you. And he was already a hero because of the cotton gin and everything. So he staged a demonstration at the Federal Armory down in Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and he was desperately short of money. He needed this so badly, and so badly did he need it that he cheated. What he did was, I won't go into the technicalities of it, but he hoodwinked all the people that came to look at him. He didn't make interchangeable parts at all. He just made a lot of flintlock mechanisms and stuffed them into the stocks of the guns and said, there we are, can I have the contract? And stupidly, the government said, yes, you can have a contract for making, I think, either 5,000 or 10,000 muskets, which he did. He delivered them 8 years late, and none of them worked properly. So it was a disaster. It was an indication of, where capitalism goes awry. And although publicly Eli Whitney is still regarded as a hero, to the engineering community, I hope that's not my phone, could well be. Would you like me to? Is that okay? Great. I hope it's not urgent. He is regarded by engineers essentially as a charlatan. But by this time, the notion of making interchangeable parts had come. The American gun manufacturers sorted it out. They started making interchangeable parts for guns at the armory in Springfield in Massachusetts, just near where I live. And so the American way of manufacturing, based on interchangeable parts, which never really took off in France for some extraordinary reason, became the American way of doing things. And factories started up making locks, making guns, and close to Springfield, making clocks. Because clocks require, obviously, if they're going to keep time, that the parts should be all essentially exactly the same. So we have the situation now in the early part of the 19th century where America is now leading the charge and making things that are very precise. And so the narrative goes on with things becoming more and more precise. There's one important divergence which I thought was quite interesting in the making of motor cars. Two Henrys are in this story, both of them born, oddly enough, in 1863, both born in relative poverty, and both who bought as teenagers the French invention of what was called a quadricycle, which was two bicycles bolted together with a small gasoline engine between them and a series of chains and things, which made it a small four-wheeled petrol or gasoline-driven vehicle, a Dion quadricycle, I think it was. So over in Michigan, I don't remember whether he might have been in Ohio, the young Henry Ford had one, and over in Manchester in England, the young Henry Royce. So these two gentlemen both had these little quadricycles, and the epiphanies that both had took precision in a diverging pair of directions, because Henry Royce said, I've got this thing, it's very noisy, it frightens the horses and all the rest of it. I'm going to make a quiet, impeccable, perfect car. I'm going to make the most perfect car in the world. And he soon formed a partnership with this Mayfair swell, the Honourable Charles Rolls, and they signed the deal in Manchester in, I think, 1904. And they called the company RollsRoyce, although to this day most engineers think because Royce made these things, it would have been called Royce Rolls. Henry Ford, by contrast, similarly gripped by a passion for automobiles. Incidentally, all the words automobile and garage and so forth are all French because the industry essentially began in France. He said, I want to make the most affordable, the most popular car. I'm going to create a car for the masses. And the car that I concentrate on in the book, both of them were essentially launched in 1908, and both enjoyed a lifespan which existed until 1923, I think it was. In Britain, it was the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, which I think to this day remains the sort of cynosure of fine automobile manufacturer. It was made throughout and by hand in Manchester and later Crewe, but also 3,000 of them were made in Springfield, Massachusetts. Most people don't know that Rolls-Royces were made, a number of them were made in America. And they were all essentially handmade and made to be as perfect as possible. Henry Ford, by contrast, wanted everyone to have a car. And during that period, 1908 to 1923, his Model T, the Tin Lizzie, they made 16 million of them. And he developed, as you'll all know from school, the assembly line. But the difference was how precision relates to these two things, is that we would probably say that the Rolls-Royce was likely to be the more precisely made of the two. That may be true, but it was made by hand, and if something didn't fit, the engineer would simply take the part out, use a file, get it to fit, and make the machine like that. Whereas Henry Ford, having a production line, trusted that all the parts that were being fed from hoppers and so forth on an upper floor of the factory would be precisely made and interchangeable. And if they weren't, if one part turned out not to fit, the whole production line ground to a halt, and it cost thousands. So it's cheap cars that rely on precision. Mass manufacturing demands precision, whereas hand making, there's a much greater degree of, as it were, flexibility in this. So I look at cars, and then it gets more and more precise. And I talk about the Hubble telescope. I'm very keen on optics, and I should tell you, just quite amusing, I'm very keen on a particular lens for a particular type of camera and its optics. It's called it's a Leica lens, 35mm f1.4 Summicron. I work in Massachusetts in an old barn. It's a granary, it's a very small thing, 21 by 24, I think, which used to store grain. And I saw the posts and beams on a farm up in upstate New York, bought them for a small amount of money, had them cleaned and brought them down to my little property and had it re-erected, and that's where I work. The internal configuration of the thing is that there's a sort of mezzanine where I've got a bed people can stay, and you look over the edge, and there down below is the shambles that is my desk with computers and books and all that sort of stuff. Well, there was a book published about 10 years ago now on barn conversions, and most of them were sort of grand barns that were turned into spectacular houses. But this very modest thing, for 500 square feet, featured in this book, and there's a picture of it taken at evening there's the stone wall in front and this funny little building. And then internally, the photographer took a photograph from the mezzanine looking down on my desk. Well, there's a rather eccentric fellow, I didn't know him at the time, who lives not too far from me, a few miles, who bought the book and thought, I love that building. I want to know who owns it. And he noticed that in the photograph, which was clearly taken with a very good lens, there was a copy of the New York Review of Books with an address label on it. And he blew it up and blew it up and blew it up, and eventually there was my name and address, and he rang me up and he said, I'm terribly sorry. I hope this isn't rude, but you are the owner. And then we became fast friends. He's a very peculiar man, but this was to introduce the stories that lead into the making of the Hubble and into the making of the telescope that is going to supplant the Hubble, which is going to be as precise in its own way as the LIGO thing, which is the James Webb Space Telescope, but that is suffering most terrible delays. So we're now getting into the realm of ultra precision, and looking at my watch, I have to be very careful, but let me just sort of tell you a little bit about the leading edge, bleeding edge of precision today. There was a spectacular near catastrophe in 2010, November, I think it was, when a Qantas fully loaded Airbus A380, one of those great double-decker planes, was going from Singapore to Sydney. I think it had 459 passengers on board and 40 or so crew. And it took off 10 o'clock in the morning on time, and it, all four engines, they were RollsRoyce Trent 900s, and it took off full power, and at 7,000 feet, an enormous explosion, and the inboard port side, left-hand side engine blew up, and rained shrapnel all over the place, which tore through the engine cowling, tore through the wings, evidently destroyed all the hydraulics and the controls and the electronics, and fuel gushing out of the aircraft. Well, I won't go into the details of how it landed and the problems when it did land, and it took many hours before it was safe enough to disembark the passengers, but no one was hurt. But of course, a major investigation into what would cause what's called an uncontained rotor failure, which is similar, although much worse, than what happened to a Southwest Airlines the other day, going from, I think, LaGuardia to Dallas. What they discovered was that in the very heart of a jet engine, where things are operating, wheels are spinning, fans are spinning, at a temperature much higher than the melting point of the metal from which these things are made. And how they cool these blades is something that completely fascinates me and very much plays into this story. But there was a tiny pipe about the diameter of a drinking straw, and it supplied oil to the bearing on which this big titanium rotor turned. And it had been mismachined at a factory in Hucknall, in, I think, Derbyshire or Northamptonshire, by an operator using a machine by 1/1000th of a millimeter off. The wall of this tiny tube was just 1/1000th of a millimeter thinner than it should have been. And everything about the journey of that plane and the workings of the internals is well known. It took off, it had a short takeoff from Los Angeles, 24 hours before, and that placed this tube under great stress. It landed safely in London, took off for Singapore, much the same thing happened, and then it took off from Singapore, with all the engines running under full power. The thin wall of this pipe fractured, oil spewed out onto this titanium wheel. It instantly flashed into fire. The wheel instantly began to lose shape and to wobble. All the blades detached from it, and they flew out of the engine, and the shrapnel cascade of it caused near destruction of the aircraft. And one has to ask, at least I ask in this book, is whether mechanical precision at tolerances like that is perhaps coming to the edge of human ability to make things, and whether we should sort of calm down a bit and sort of relax. But the field of electronic precision is even more extraordinary. An iPhone, an Apple iPhone, is powered by, or at least is the computing power is supplied by a chip, which is about as big as my pinky fingernail, called an A11 chip, which is made in a factory in Taiwan. And it has 4.3 billion transistors in it. Not million, but billion transistors. So you can imagine how tiny those transistors are. Transistors, remember, were invented in 1948 in Bell Labs in New Jersey. And the first transistor was about as big as my hand. And now you can fit 4 billion of these little things onto something which is as small as my pinky finger. There are more transistors in the world today than there are leaves on all the trees in all the world today. It's an extraordinary statistic. These things are being made to near atomic sizes, which introduces all sorts of problems. If you know your Heisenberg, and things behave very peculiar down at those levels. So in the electronic field as well, one's wondering whether we're getting to the edge, to the limit. And so that's sort of what the book is about, but it then begins to question, do we need ultra precision? Is it as necessary and beneficial as all that? And to sort of try and answer that, I go to Japan, which is where my wife is from, and where I believe, although it is a country which since the Second World War has become known for very precise things, Canon and Nikon and so on and so forth, it's also a country where there's government honor is given to people that practice craftsmanship in wood or in lacquerware or in bamboo. And I sort of ask the question rhetorically towards the end of the book, whether the worship of titanium, whether it is equally valuable to revere and worship bamboo and wood and things that are not precise. And to illustrate this point, I want to go back to Colin Povey, the man that gave me the idea to write the book in the first place, because he, I think I might have mentioned this, I never met him until last night. He flew up from Florida to meet me in Washington, D.C., and it was extremely moving. I mean, it's his book in a way. But about 3 weeks ago, he sent me, and I'm hoping, if I put my hand, it is here, yes, I've felt it. He sent me a trinket. He said, to welcome your book into the world, I want to send you a trinket. And he did, and I think I mentioned to you that he was a scientific glassblower. Well, you won't be able to see this terribly well, but this is, can anyone, there's a number of people do know what this is. Can anyone recognize what it is? It's a Klein bottle, exactly. And a Klein bottle, you, sir, could maybe confirm whether or not I'm right. A Mobius strip, you'll probably know what that is, a little thing of paper, and you turn it and it comes to have one surface. Well, this is a recurving three-dimensional object with only one surface. And it's a fantastically difficult thing to make. And it's the triumph of, I think I'm right in saying, of the glassblower's art, particularly because of this little junction here where the tube goes back into itself and emerges as a little hole at this end. It's a sort of Escher type thing. So he sent it to me, and what I love about it most of all, it's not at all precise. It's totally imprecise. This comes from a man who is fascinated by the concept of precision, but in his heart he loves imprecision, the imperfect, and the beautiful. And I think this is a wonderful thing to behold, and it gives us some perspective, whether our reverence should be for the ultra-precise or for the imperfect, both of which have their own value. So I'll leave it at that and hope someone might have a question, but thank you very much indeed.
Actually, I have two questions, but I'll give you the more major one. There occasionally on PBS have specials, sort of like what you're discussing. There was a guy named Jacob Bernowski years ago, things like that. So I'm wondering if you've talked, I mean, if I tried calling them, they wouldn't listen. But if you called like WHYY or somebody around here or somebody in Washington, D.C. or New York or Boston, just be interesting enough, at least for a PBS special, that there may be something like, you know, in science and technology and practical applications, things like that. It could be already working on that. It could be that nobody's interested, but I'm just putting it out as a suggestion.
Well, I think it's a wonderful suggestion. And I must say, this is the second day of the tour, and people have come out in gratifying numbers. And I think I came here, do you remember that horrible snowy day about 6 or 8 weeks ago? I came down when all Philadelphia was supposed to shut down. In fact, it was not that bad a snowstorm at all. But I came down for the PLA, the Public Library Association conference here, the convention, and they were given free what are called ARCs, advanced readers' copies of the book. And there was a very long line of librarians wanting this book. But interestingly, nearly all of them said, this is for my uncle or my father or my nephew or my niece. He's an engineer. And I think there's a feeling that the engineering community is underserved, as it were, by books that might be of interest to the laity as well. So I'm sort of cautiously hoping, and if that is so, then the idea of PBS or someone doing a television series on the importance of precision, I think it's a very good suggestion, and with any luck, it might be one that flies.
How has your process of research changed over the years as the quality, the type, the formats, the medium of research has changed, the material available to you has changed?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it began to change when I was at the beginning of the successful part of my career. The successful part of my career began in 1998. Prior to that, there was a long, and in my view, moderately distinguished, but totally unsuccessful, with book after book after book, which was published, quite politely reviewed, appeared in a bookshop for a very short amount of time, and then made it to the remainder table. So in those days, research was conducted, by going places for a start, meeting people, interviewing them, and looking through papers, looking through volumes of diaries or whatever. Then come 1998, and this book, The Professor and the Madman, and that was still done by going to the lunatic asylum where W.C. Minor was incarcerated and looking at these beautifully copperplate written notations. But more or less immediately after that, well, actually, no, the book after that was the Map That Changed the World, which was also required looking at original documents in libraries, in musty basements and so forth. But after that, and I think the book after that was probably Krakatoa, now you're talking about digitized documents and things where I didn't, in theory, have to leave the house. I could look at the US Geological Survey's papers about eruptions in Indonesia online. So things became different in a way, and yet my own, I suppose, because my my upbringing was very much as a newspaper reporter and a traveller, I still keenly wanted to go places and didn't just want to sit at home and stitch it together by going to Wikipedia, which I would never do. So for this book, this particular book, up-to-date book, and the book I'm wanting to do next, there's an awful lot of traveling involved. I mean, I just told you I went to, well, perhaps I didn't actually. I didn't tell you that I went to sort of summarize this business about precision and imprecision. I went to the Seiko factory in Morioka in northern Japan, where Seiko, as I'm sure you know, invented the quartz watch. Initially the quartz clock and then the quartz watch, which keeps impeccable time to thousandths of a second. And it's a great commercial success. And if you go to the Seiko factory, you go upstairs to the second floor, and there is the assembly line, fully mechanized, robotics employed, to make tens of thousands of electronic quartz clocks and watches. But they could see when they took me around that I was a bit dismayed, because I wanted to see something better, more interesting. And they went into, still on the second floor, we went through a pair of double doors. The noise of the production line faded away, and I went into an area which had a sort of cathedral-like calm to it. And sitting at about 40 desks were 40 men and women, all hand-making mechanical watches with hair springs and mainsprings and hands and little gear wheels and things. And they were assembling these things. The Seiko brand is called the Grand Seiko. And astonishingly, despite them being inaccurate, I mean, you have to wind them, and they may be 5 or 10 seconds fast or slow. They go out of beat rate quite rapidly. So they're not at all accurate, but people love them. I love them. I mean, I don't have one, I can't afford one, but I wear a mechanical watch here. And I like the ritual of winding it and changing the time. I have 7 or 8 clocks in the old farmhouse in which I live, and my Sunday morning ritual is to wind them all and change the hands back and forth by the few minutes that they've lost or gained, and there's a barograph which records the atmospheric pressure as well, which is also clockwork and old-fashioned, and I get great pleasure. And I remember the line from Dorothy L. Sayers' book, Gaudy Night, where she talks about walking through Oxford on a summer's night at midnight and listening to the college clocks chiming midnight in friendly disagreement. And I love that. I'm not even sure what your question was, I'm afraid. But anyway, it started this stream of consciousness. So
thank you for such a wonderful talk. I was thinking while you were answering that last question or going into the stream of consciousness about what it is that we find so compelling about having something that is not precise and seeing that it's somehow better than a precise thing. I mean, even the words we use are euphemisms. Like we say handcrafted or handmade. These things are clearly not as good at achieving whatever it is that we're trying to do with them, but for some reason there's a connection maybe from one person to another. But we're at the age now, like you stated before, with the size of things, 4.3 billion transistors, there's no way to possibly have those qualities be involved. But yet we still somehow want to have something handcrafted. I mean, most people would say when you call something handmade, they take it as given that it's a better quality of some kind. But that isn't clearly so.
Well, it isn't, exactly. Yeah. It isn't so.
Which is ironic that most people have that stuck in their head. I was wondering why it is that we want to have that connection, do you think?
I'm not sure that I can give an answer, but I can give another illustration of something that I regret very much that's going to happen in November this year, which is that the very last physical object against which we measure things is going to be abandoned. I mean, you all know that the inch is the thumb, the foot is the foot, the 1,000 feet, mille passus is a mile, and then measurements like the Chinese li changes its value depending whether the road is going uphill or downhill, and there's this wonderful Korean unit of time which posits a large granite mountain outside Seoul, and an angel flies down and brushes the summit with her wing once every 100 years Well, the length of time it takes for her to reduce that mountain to sea level is a unit of time in the Korean lexicon. So there's been this long tradition of using human scale things to standards of measurement. And then the French upset the apple cart in the 18th century by saying that thumbs and feet and angels' wings were fine and good, but the only truly stable thing was the Earth itself. And so they came up with the idea of measuring a quadrant of the planet from the pole to the equator, or at least a part of it, and extrapolating outwards, and dividing that by 10 million and giving us the meter. And that was then cast as a platinum rod, which was the meter, and that existed in a mansion outside Paris in Sèvres until 1960, when it was abandoned in favor of an electronic measurement, because this man who I call the spoilsport in chief, a physicist called James Clerk Maxwell, said that, we know the thumb and the wing and so forth are not stable, but equally nor is the Earth, because the Earth changes shape, its speed of rotation changes, it can be bombarded by meteorites, it can be lava flows and things. So the only thing which is absolutely invariant is the frequency emitted by atoms when certain things are done to those atoms. So everything's got to be done on the atomic scale. So the last bastion, the last handmade thing that exists in the world today against which anything is measured is the unit of mass, and that's the kilogram. And the kilogram, what's known as the IPK, the International Prototype Kilogram, was cast in 1889 out of a platinum in iridium alloy, and it stands in the basement in Paris where the meter had stood under 3 nested glass jars in the dark behind lock after lock after lock. And every time you go in and buy a kilogram of sugar, or whether you might weigh a jumbo jet or you might weigh a person, that weight is measured by a scale, and those scales are calibrated in America against the national standard kilograms which are kept in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and those, every so often, twice a year or so, are taken to Paris and measured against what are called the témoins, which are 6 platinum cylinders which are precise copies of the one under the 3 thingies. They're called witness masses. And then only 4 times since 1889 have the 3 cloches been taken off, and the témoins, the witness cylinders, measured against the IPK, Le Grand K. But in November, the people that, the BIPM, the Bureau International de Poids de Mesure, is going to meet and formally declare that the IPK is obsolete and mass is going to be measured in terms of the Planck constant and the speed of light. So it's an important moment in history, and this year, 2018, is... I regret it very much, because I sort of feel that with the kilogram now and the meter being expressed merely in numbers by things I can't see and touch, the world is sort of spinning out of control. I remember that line from The War of the Worlds about the Martians coming with their cool and unsympathetic intelligence, and I feel that that is taking us over. I want the platinum back.
I wonder, you spoke about the next book that you're writing. Do your ideas for books come like periodically, or do you have a reserve of ideas that you are particularly interested in that you want to write?
Well, I normally have 2 or 3 things I think I'd like to write, and mostly my editors would say, it's not commercial, it's not going to work. But the idea that what I want to write now, and I think I will be able to, is I used to live when I was a small boy in Oklahoma, and I was fascinated by the story of the Oklahoma land run of 1889. And I'd be interested to know, actually, a show of hands, how many people here know about the 22nd of April, 1889, the land run was how Oklahoma. So there's one. Well, rush or run, but yes, okay. So a small number of people. I mean, that's certainly up in Massachusetts. I ask people around dinner tables, and they've not the foggiest idea what I'm talking about. They just know the politics of contemporary Oklahoma and get so depressed they don't want to talk about it any further. But I want to use this, and what you may know is that these thousands of people that wish to have land gathered on the line in the southern end of Kansas, and at a signal from a cavalry officer at noon on that particular day, spurred their horses and their wagons and things and got to places. And the particular place that I'm interested in is Guthrie, Oklahoma, which was the first state capital. And I want to know what happened. That each person that staked a claim could get 160 acres of land. And what then happened? And it's really a look at the private ownership of land worldwide. I look at the Enclosures Acts in England and the collectivization of the farms in the Ukraine and that sort of thing. But anyway, it's a book about the love of land, and I hope the publisher will go for it.
Making manufacturing more precise?
Yes, in fact, the big guru of precision in this country is an English professor at the University of North Carolina, and he's very big on what's it called? I forget the word. It's not aggregative or cumulative, additive engineering. And he says, for now, it's not precise enough, but we'll get there. So we're in the early stages in terms of its precision and the tolerances. But he has no doubt that it is the future. So more cool, unsympathetic intelligence coming down the pike. And I think with you, sir, that better be it. Thank you very much indeed.